Mr. Bruce Lai, Director of the European Division of the Ministry of Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, members of our distinguished panel, both here and in cyberspace, colleagues and members of the U.W.I community, ladies and gentlemen, good morning again. As Director of the U.W.I Institute of International Relations, I take great pride and pleasure in welcoming you to this panel discussion in which we will explore the life and legacy of former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, honor his memory and his outstanding contribution to global peace and development. A special welcome again to our panelists, all of whom have close links with the Institute of International Relations. And I would like to make special mention of our former director, Professor Andy Knight. Welcome, Andy. Mr. Curtis Reynolds, who is an alumnus of this institution. My friend and colleague, Dr. Philip Osai. Morning, Philip. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good morning.
Who has been associated with Salises for many years. And Professor Bierstecker, who has led at least 2 review committees for UWI. It is a pleasure to have all our panelists, including Her Excellency Ms. Quales, who is with us live. And thank you very much for taking the time to participate in our forum today. I pause to recognize the presence of Mr. Reginald Dumas. Welcome, Mr. Dumas. It is a great pleasure and honor to have you join us. Now, the UWI treasures the memories of its encounters with Kofi Annan. He visited this institute back in the 1960s, and in fact, he gave guest lectures to an early generation of students. He also visited the UWI's Mona campus in 1998 and received an honorary doctorate. I was fortunate enough to be present on that occasion, in which Mr. Annan referred extensively to the work of Caribbean nationals in the service of the UN, in peace building, development, and human rights. We have some worthy examples of such individuals on our panel today. On that occasion, Mr. Annan spoke also of the role of universities and other educational institutions in advancing the cause and mission of the United Nations through education, training, and knowledge generation. Today's panel is a very small contribution to that cause, and we hope that people both here in the wider Caribbean and internationally will have the opportunity to visit our website and to access the recording of this event. Actually, I think the event is going to be both on the IIR website, and I'm very happy to see U.W.I TV here today. So it will be available on the wider U.W.I TV network. Kofi Annan was a truly outstanding leader of the UN, the first international civil servant to assume the position of Secretary General, who, together with the UN itself, would be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2001. He devoted the major part of his life to the cause of global governance and multilateral cooperation. He is noted for his work on UN reform, excuse me, and the construction of new types of partnerships, for providing new roadmaps for national and international development, and for grappling with the monumental challenges to peace, security, and human rights protection that the international community has experienced in the turbulent years of the 1990s and the early 21st century. As all multilateral institutions confront existential challenges today, much can be learned by reviewing the past decades and Kofi Annan's record of patience, persistence, diplomacy, and good humor. Our panel today will enlighten us much more on this topic. Excuse me. As Jean Frémont, a retired Swiss academic, notes in a recent tribute, we have a major responsibility to continue Annan's work, to strengthen and maintain multilateralism. We can look to his initiatives and achievements for inspiration. We live in a world with a huge leadership deficit. Kofi Annan's lifetime of service and personality, and his personality, provide an excellent role model in these times, especially for our young people in their communities as they strive to contribute, to educate themselves, and to pursue meaningful careers. I hope that we all enjoy this morning's proceedings. Thank you very much. And I would now like to call on Mr. Bruce Lai to bring us greetings from the Ministry of Foreign and Caricom Affairs of Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you, Professor, and good morning all. Members of the Diplomatic Corps, fellow panelists, staff of the Institute, students, specially invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to bring greetings on behalf of the Ministry of Foreign and Caricom Affairs at today's panel discussion in recognition of the life and contribution of the late Kofi Annan, former Secretary General of the United Nations. It is truly commendable and very fitting that the Institute has carved out a space for reflection on the legacy of this extraordinary figure, who rose through the ranks of the United Nations to head the organization for 10 challenging and critical years. His passing has provided the international community with a peerless opportunity to reflect, not just on the character of the man, but also on the causes he embraced and his views on multilateralism. This discussion is a particularly timely one, given recent criticisms regarding the effectiveness and legitimacy of the United Nations and related bodies. Kofi Annan held the view that if the UN did not already exist, it would have to be created. Indeed, it is difficult to identify a feasible alternative for joint action by the international community to address climate change, terrorism, poverty, and other pressing contemporary challenges. Notwithstanding his firm belief in the indispensability of the UN, the former Secretary General was frank about its shortcomings and limitations. As such, he undertook reforms during his tenure, aimed at revitalizing the organization and making it more relevant to the common man. As a small island developing state, Trinidad and Tobago recognizes the value of and benefits from robust engagement with the premier multilateral organization to which Mr. Annan devoted so many decades of his life. This country has leveraged its membership in the UN to partner with fellow member states in pursuit of shared interests, including economic and social development and peace and security. In keeping with this proven commitment to multilateralism, the Ministry is actively engaged in preparation for the imminent participation of a delegation from Trinidad and Tobago at the 73rd regular session of the UN General Assembly in New York. In fact, the start of High-Level Week is just a few days away. In the weeks since his passing, Kofi Annan, the leader, humanitarian, statesman, diplomat, and peacemaker, has been the subject of countless accolades, and deservedly so. From his instrumental role in the outlining and achievement of the Millennium Development Goals, to his tireless pursuit of an end to HIV/AIDS, from the use of his good offices to diffuse tense political situations across the globe, to his pursuit of peace through the Kofi Annan Foundation, the former Secretary General made his mark on the international community through his leadership. This is certainly something to be celebrated. In closing, I take the opportunity to highlight one aspect of the former Secretary General's connection with Trinidad and Tobago. The records of the Ministry of Foreign and Caricom Affairs indicate that Mr. Annan, his wife, and some other members of his family spent about 2 weeks in this country over the period late December 2003 to to early January 2004. My understanding is that he spent Christmas and rang in the New Year right here in Trinidad and Tobago. And while the primary purpose of the visit of the former Secretary General to our shores was rest and relaxation, he reportedly grasped the opportunity to meet with the then Prime Minister for discussions on the role of Caricom in Haiti, among other matters. This is a fitting illustration of Mr. Annan's tireless commitment to his calling and his enduring passion for the pursuit of peace and equality. May his legacy endure in the United Nations, the organization to which he dedicated most of his life, as well as in each one of us who has been impacted by his stellar contribution. I thank you.
Distinguished panelists, members of the Diplomatic Corps, special invitees, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Anita Montut and I'm a lecturer here at the Institute of International Relations. I am honored to have been asked to introduce this distinguished panel of speakers. Let me also add my deep appreciation to the presenters for their participation here at this event today, and to you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending this event. I introduce the speakers in the order in which they appear on the program, starting with Mr. Reginald Dumas. This is just a few points from their bio for an expanded version. You may refer to the table on my right after this presentation, after this event. Mr. Reginald Dumas is a graduate of the Graduate Institute of International Studies, Geneva, and holds an honorary doctorate of laws from the University of the West Indies. He was among the first group of diplomats in the Trinidad and Tobago Foreign Service in 1962 and has served in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and North America. He left the Foreign Service in 1988 as ambassador to Washington and permanent representative to the Organization of American States to become permanent secretary to the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago and head of the public service. In 2004, he was appointed by Kofi Annan as his special advisor on Haiti. He is a frequent commentator on current affairs and has published 4 books. Professor Andy Knight is professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Alberta and former director of the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies. He is a past departmental chair at the University of Alberta. He serves as advisory board member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on the Welfare of Children and was a governor of the International Development Research Center from 2007 to 2012. Professor Knight is currently co-editor-in-chief of African Security Journal and has co-edited Global Governance Journal from 2000 to 2005, during which time he was also vice chair of the Academic Council of the United Nations System. An expert on United Nations reform and the transformation of multilateral institutions, Professor Knight has written several books and journal articles on the subject. He has won several academic awards and prizes and has been honored for his work in Canada as well as internationally. Professor Thomas Bisteker received his PhD and master's degree from MIT and his BA from the University of Chicago. He was the Gesteker Professor of International Security and Director for Policy Research at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. He previously directed the Graduate Institute's program for the study of international governance, recently renamed the Global Governance Center, the Watson Institute for International Studies at Brown University, and has also taught at Yale University and the University of Southern California. He has authored and edited 10 books. Professor Bisteker was the principal developer of Sanctions App, a tool for mobile devices created in 2013 to access information about targeted sanctions at the UN. Professor Philip Duku Osei. He is currently the Deputy Rector of the Ghana Institute of Management and Public Administration. Prior to his present engagement, he was the first Dean of the School of Public Service and Governance at the Ghana Institute of Management and Public Administration in 2014. He is a double Commonwealth Scholar and a John Anderson Scholar of 1992-1993 while doing his PhD. Professor Osei has made scholarly contributions, publishing several books and articles in the areas of public policy and management, and has written on public sector reform and management of public policy in Africa and the Caribbean. He has advised many international development agencies and governments in Africa and the Caribbean. Ms. Diane Qualis, she's a graduate of the University of the West Indies, Mona, and holds a BSc in International Relations and an MSc in Development Studies from Salisis. She's the director of the ECLAC Sub-Regional Headquarters for the Caribbean. Previously, she served consecutively as chief of the Small Islands Developing States Unit and as head of partnerships for sustainable development in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs at the United Nations headquarters in New York. She's a 20-year veteran of the Jamaica Foreign Service. Her final assignment before joining the UN Secretariat was as Deputy Permanent Representative of Jamaica to the United Nations, New York, from 1998 to 2002. During this period, she served on several committees and represented Jamaica on the first Committee for Disarmament and International Security of the United Nations Assembly, serving as the Caricom spokesperson on all international security matters. She was elected the first female chair of the UN Disarmament Commission at its 2000 session. In 2003, was invited by the late Secretary General Kofi Annan to serve on his advisory board on disarmament issues. And Mr. Curtis Reynolds, he holds a master's degree in government from Harvard University, a postgraduate diploma from the Institute of International Relations, and a Bachelor of Arts degree, a BA in Economics and Law from the University of the West Indies. He is the former secretary of the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters, 2014 to 2016. Mr. Reynolds also served in a number of crisis and conflict areas around the world. Prior to his international engagement, Mr. Reynolds served with the government of St. Lucia in the Ministry of Finance and St. Lucia Diplomatic Service. He is currently an international affairs consultant focused on international development and security. I now invite the presenters to speak in the order in which they appear on the program, starting with Mr. Dumas, followed by Professor Knight, Professor Bisteker, Professor Osei, Ms. Qualis, and Mr. Reynolds. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and good morning. Sorry, but I just flew in from Tobago. It's not easy, as you know, to travel these days between these two continents. I thank the Institute for inviting me to speak and to say something about Kofi. I'm asked to speak on personal thoughts and reflections. Today is Friday, which is not a bad day to be having this event. Firstly, today is the International Day of Peace, which is being celebrated now at the UN. And at this moment, actually, there is a commemorative service in honor of Kofi, which is being held at the General Assembly in New York. And also, Kofi came from the Akan people of Ghana, and I don't know how many of you know, but among the Akan, a boy born on Friday is called Kofi. A lot of these names have become distorted in Trinidad and Tobago. I don't know if Maxi knows that his surname comes from Kofi, but he might hear one of these days. Kofi and I'm almost embarrassed to say that in this company of young people, but Kofi and I knew each other for very nearly 60 years. From the time we first met in 1961 in Geneva at the Graduate Institute of International Studies. I was leaving, he was just arriving. We really came to know each other much better in Ethiopia a few years later, when he was a junior official at the Economic Commission for Africa, the United Nations, and I was at the Embassy of Trinidad and Tobago, which is now closed. We became very firm friends. I'm not quite sure why, but we took to each other. And our respective wives at the time took to each other as well. He at least remarried. I have not been able to find that level of courage. Ethiopia at the time was a rather, I don't know what it's like now, but at the time was a rather strange society. Ethiopia had been cut off really from the world, with the possible exception of the invasion by Mussolini and the occupation between 1936 and 1941. But other than that, it really was not part of the world. And it had a great problem with foreigners generally, Ferengi, they call us. And it had a particular problem with black Africans, because Ethiopians did not see themselves as African. They saw themselves as Ethiopians. And if you pointed out that Ethiopia was part of Africa, they said, yes, it's in Africa, but not of Africa. Kofi and his then wife, Titi, who was from Nigeria, like other Africans, quote unquote, had their difficulties. But Kofi was a very easygoing fellow, and I think worked around that. He spent, as has been just said, he spent almost all his professional life at the UN. All but, as I recall, 2 years when he was on secondment to the government of Ghana as head of the Ghana Tourist Office. It was not an experience he wished to repeat, and he was quite happy to get back to the UN. What sort of person was he? Well, Kofi was very quiet, very soft-spoken, always polite, an extremely good listener, which is something perhaps that some of our politicians can learn, and extremely shrewd. Now, because he was quiet and soft-spoken, and because he liked to hear both sides, or if there were more than two sides, whatever sides of a particular issue, he was regarded by a lot of people, especially Americans, who like to think that they are very decisive. He was regarded as weak. Now, nothing could have been further from the truth, as I know. And he had his enemies, he had his drawbacks. He was much criticized at a certain point in the United States. There were senators, Republican senators, as you might guess, who were openly calling for him to resign, for him to go, because of certain things that they felt he had done which he ought not to have done. I shall be writing something myself. In fact, I've already started. And I shall be discussing some of these things in more detail in writing. This is not, at this moment, the time for that. He and I had kept in touch with each other over the years. We stayed with each other over the years. I stayed with him in Ghana. He stayed with me in Washington on a couple of occasions. And I would call him from time to time because I knew the pressures that he was under as a friend, simply to offer such support as I could do in the very difficult times that he was experiencing, and some of the times were extremely difficult. Mr. Lai says that it is his understanding that he came here in 2003. That is a correct understanding. It was I who invited him. Because I called him one day from Tobago, and I said, why don't you come to Tobago and spend some time? Because all these licks you get in there in New York, you know. And he was non-committal, but a couple of months later, he called me, and one morning, I'm sitting in my study in Tobago, and he said, I'm coming to Tobago. I said, just so? He said, yes, I have to get away. And he did. He and his wife, this is the second wife, Nan, from Sweden, and his 2 children by his first marriage, plus her daughter from her first marriage and her daughter's husband and child. And they all came and spent a couple of weeks in Tobago at the Arnesville Hotel, which was well prepared, a place right down on the beach. They could go out and no one to disturb them. There was security, of course. They had their UN security and they had local security as well. And I was glad that I had done so, because when I went to Crown Point Airport to meet them off the plane, I was absolutely horrified by his appearance. He was gaunt. His suit was just hanging there. He was like a scarecrow. And I realized then the difficulties that he had been having. I was happy to note that when he left 2 weeks later, and the wife stayed on, by the way, for another week. The ministry might have that too. He had put on weight, and I was happy to see that. I did not go to his funeral, but my daughter did. She represented me and flew out to Accra. And she's already given me a fairly detailed account, but I have to see her again tomorrow morning, so I expect to get some more details. But she received an invitation in my absence, direct from the President of Ghana, Nana Akufo-Addo. And I would just like to end with something from a tribute from a close colleague of his, Jeffrey Sachs, who worked with him on the Millennium Development Goals. And this was what Sachs wrote the day after Kofi died. Kofi Annan inspired and protected us, all too often, from our own worst instincts and flawed judgments. He taught us the inestimable value of diplomacy, the art of finding common ground by listening to and respecting others. There was no finer practitioner of such exalted decency in our time. That was Kofi Annan that I knew, whatever his detractors may say. A man who I was proud to call my friend. I'm proud and honored to call my friend, who fought constantly for peace and who has left a legacy which we ought to build on of efforts towards international peace, and who has now found his own eternal peace. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to you, albeit from a distance. I recognize my old stomping grounds there at the Institute of International Relations. I want to thank Jessica Byron, Anita Montoute, and the other members of the committee for inviting me to take part in this event. And I'm happy to see my fellow panelists as well. Wonderful to see you all. This is a good lineup, I think, to speak about the legacy and life of Kofi Annan. In reflecting on the life and legacy of the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, the very first image I had that came to my mind was that of a funambulist. And many of you may have been to a circus and watched with your heart in your hand a woman or a man walking across a tight rope many feet into the air. or you may have watched the heart-stopping documentary called Man on Wire, which depicted the death-defying funambulist Philippe Petit as he walked across both ways for 45 minutes across the tethered top of the Twin Towers at the World Trade Center. Now, those buildings are unfortunately no longer in existence due to the terrorist attack of 9/11, 2001. But Philippe Petit, his incredible feat lives on in the marvelous movie, The Walk, starring Joseph Gordon-Levitt. I've listened to funambulists talk about the skill involved in walking along a thin wire or a tight rope at many feet in the air, without a harness and with no safety net beneath them. What they describe is the art of achieving moments of near perfect balance, but always being aware of the imperfection of body and mind, and of the potential frailty of the wire or the rope and the construction of the rigging. These funambulists are very much cognizant of the fact that there are many ways to walk, even when your mind tells you that there are not. You have to be in the moment, you have to be present. And being present is a demanding exercise. To attain equilibrium in the moment, especially when that tense balance is between earth and sky, one has to face fear as one balances opposing forces. One has to pay attention to detail and prepare oneself in such a way that nothing is left to chance. One has to be not only aware of the atmospheric conditions and the prevailing wind patterns, but also be prepared along the precarious journey to make necessary adjustments to those conditions and circumstances. Funambulism, my friends, is a very serious business. It involves risk, pain, fatigue, rigor, attention, determination, and courage. In effect, this art that's normally reserved for the circus is in fact a matter of life and death. And Kofi Annan, the first and only UN Secretary General to have come from the ranks of the UN Secretariat, reminded me very much of a funambulist. He exhibited qualities of a tightrope walker, fiercely independent as a global actor, in possession of a guiding vision in the exercise of his authority, an ability to combine pragmatism and hard-headedness with humanity and empathy in his quest for human progress and solidarity, and a willingness to put his career and life on the line to maintain that precarious balance between state sovereignty and Article 2.7 of the UN Charter, and the prescient drive to check great power aggression and expand the range of actors, civil society actors, private sector actors, celebrities, business leaders, etc., to be involved in the decisions that could guarantee the security of the ordinary person. Annan's walk on the tightrope of the United Nations Secretary General's mandate was incredibly risky, unorthodox, colorful, and impactful. As the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations and the first Black sub-Saharan African chosen for that role, Kofi Annan almost did not make it as head of the world body. In 1994, as head of UN Peacekeeping, Annan went through a very painful experience, which could have toppled the ordinary person. The post-Cold War period had erupted in several unfavorable conditions, which made his job as the UN Secretary General for Peacekeeping operations exceedingly challenging, as several interstate conflicts and trouble spots around the globe unsettled him. He was trying to broker the peace with very little support from major powers in the United Nations Security Council. And the massacre of 800,000 Tutsis and Mother Hutus in Rwanda was, I think, the disequilibrium that shook him to the core. As head of the UN peacekeeping operations, he was warned by General Romeo Dallaire that Hutu extremists was about to carry out an attack on Tutsis and moderate Hutus. Over 3 months, Annan pleaded with world leaders to intervene to stop the genocide, but they did nothing. The Rwanda genocide, I think, has weighed heavily on the conscience of Kofi Annan. He referred to this as a very painful experience, but he struggled with walking that fine line between the guilt of so many deaths in Rwanda and trying to understand the context to explain why the major powers were reluctant to intervene. For one thing, the United States did not want to jump into another African conflict like the one in that failed state, Somalia, in which the US soldiers were killed, some of them stripped naked and dragged into the streets of Mogadishu. That experience caused the United States and other major powers to reaffirm the bedrock principle of Article 2.7 of the United Nations Charter, which states that nothing in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. Like a funambulist, Annan tried to find a balance between the nation state's right to self-interest and the demands of the post-Cold War era to respect the common interests, including human rights and the need to protect individuals from threats to their lives. Boutros Ghali was expected to win a second term as UN Secretary General in 1996. Indeed, 14 of the 15 members of the United Nations Security Council voted to give him a second 5-year term. But the United States, which had been unhappy with Boutros Ghali's performance in the job, vetoed the idea of a second term. Kofi Annan's name was on the ballot, but he was in the middle of the pack and had the dubious distinction of being supported by the Americans. France did not want to support any Washington-supported candidate, and it was adamant that whoever replaced Boutros Ghali should be a French speaker. When Annan's supporters reminded the French ambassador that to the UN that Annan, in fact, spoke French, that individual responded that he did not speak French well enough. But the soft-spoken and erudite Annan broke the tension by jokingly saying, "I now speak English with a French accent." Like a funambulist, Annan was able to maintain his equilibrium amidst this potentially fatal situation. And in the end, he received a unanimous vote of the UN Security Council, became UN Secretary General in 1997, serving 2 terms. During his time in office, Kofi Annan was often praised for his Zen-like character, a disposition that certainly benefits any funambulist. His quiet, soft-spoken, articulate, non-offensive, but charismatic personality was evident as he carried out his role as the United Nations Chief Administrative Officer. As a grandson of tribal chiefs in the Gold Coast, that's Ghana, and as the son of a provincial governor in Ghana, Kofi Annan exuded an aristocratic demeanor and a style of leadership that combined personal charm, empathy, intellectual gravitas, and sartorial elegance. His academic training in management and his many years of administrative and managerial experience working within the UN system proved invaluable, I think, for the specific time in which he was placed in that office. Some have argued that Annan was more a secretary than a general in his execution of his duties. He was certainly much more diplomatic than his predecessor, and due to his high emotional IQ, was able to gain the trust, loyalty, admiration, and even adulation of most of UN staff members. At the same time, Kofi Annan was no pushover. He came into the position with the intention of championing human rights, advocating for humanitarian intervention, finding ways to protect civilians caught up in wars. He knew that he would meet stiff opposition from adherents to traditional structural realist principles, but he was determined to nudge major states into doing what was right, even when it transcended their narrow political self-interest. He used the United Nations Security Council bully pulpit when it was necessary. He brought into the UN senior positions of highly talented group of senior advisors who helped to steady him during very turbulent times. He recognized the determination of the US and the other big powers to push the United Nations system to undergo major reforms. But while carrying out those reforms, I think Annan reminded the United Nations member states that while administrative and managerial changes were indeed necessary for the smooth functioning of the organization, the environment within which the world body operated was also changing. Thus, the United Nations also needed to adapt to a world with new actors, new responsibilities, new possibilities for peace and progress. During a pivotal speech at the United Nations General Assembly on the 20th of September, 1999, we almost have that anniversary today, it was just yesterday, 20th September, Kofi Annan reminded the United Nations member states that his highest duty as UN Secretary General was to restore the United Nations to its rightful role in the pursuit of peace and security, and to bring it closer to the people it served. He was adamant that state sovereignty needed to be redefined because of the impact of the forces of globalization and international cooperation. He stated that the state ought to be the servant of the people and not the other way around. And he pushed back on states, forcing them to rethink how the United Nations should respond to political, human rights, and humanitarian crises affecting much of the world. In that speech in 1999, he demonstrated a keen understanding of the dilemmas of humanitarian intervention and proposed several ways to balance the uncomfortable disequilibrium of the new era, a time when strictly traditional notions of sovereignty could no longer do justice to the aspirations of peoples everywhere to attain their fundamental freedoms. Annan reminded United Nations member states that the Charter itself, in its very letter and spirit, affirmed fundamental human rights. He also pointed out that the Charter stated that armed forces should not be used save in the common interest. The challenge for him, of course, was in deciding what is common interest, who will define it, who will define it, who will defend it, under whose authority, and what means of intervention. Finding answers to those questions led Kofi Annan to embrace the responsibility to protect norm, which struck a balance by reconceptualizing sovereignty as responsibility. According to Annan, while states do have a responsibility to protect their citizens from harm and risks, when those same states fail to carry out that responsibility, then the international community should reserve the right to do so, particularly when those citizens are threatened by genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. Further, that responsibility includes the responsibility to prevent and to rebuild. And like any funambulist, Kofi Annan, as Secretary General of the United Nations, exhibited qualities that allowed him to stay focused on his normative goals, to imagine many ways to walk, to maintain a balance that was not always perfect all the time. By embracing the norm of R2P, Annan brought a certain intellectual rigor to his tightrope walking. His vision for adaptation and change can be found in several efforts at United Nations reform during his tenure, in the Millennium Declaration of 2000, in his high-level panel on threats and challenges and change in 2004, and in his report, Enlarge Freedom, Towards Development, Security, and Human Rights for All in 2005, as well as his report by the panel of eminent persons on UN civil society relations. His deft skill of soft leadership, tact, integrity was sufficient to nudge the big powers into accepting many of his solutions. But he used his good offices to consult not only with the major powers, but also with rock stars like Bono, soccer stars like Pele, and I have a great story about Pele, and my wife meeting Pele in the elevator going up to the Secretary General's office. He was there having to receive a book of mine that just came out, and I happened to be very late in terms of getting to the office, and my wife on the elevator saw Kofi Annan and Pele walk out of the office and was just floored by this because both were her idols. Pele, the great soccer player, Kofi Annan, the great guy from Ghana, and of course my wife spent some time in Ghana, so she had a great admiration for Kofi Annan. But he also spent time with major business leaders like Bill Gates, as well as the heads of governments, NGOs, multinational corporations, and CSOs. He expanded the range of diplomacy, but wasn't afraid to use the bully pulpit for public diplomacy to check great power aggression. But his biggest contribution could well be his championing of the R2P norm, an effort to establish the International Criminal Court, a legal instrument designed to end impunity of state leaders and military commanders who commit atrocious crimes against humanity. Long after his stint as Secretary General, Kofi Annan continued to work on issues like poverty alleviation, conflict resolution, and humanitarian relief. And being a funambulist takes effort, skill, determination, and keeping one's eye on the end goal. Kofi Annan exhibited these qualities. May he rest in eternal peace. After a life well lived, a job well done, a walk well taken during a precarious time, our world is much better off for him being here. He will surely be missed by many of us. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks, Andy, and thanks to the previous speakers. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this very special program. I'd like to extend particular thanks to Jessica Byron and to her colleagues at the Institute for organizing the event. It turns out I had the good fortune of seeing Jessica in Geneva just a few days ago, earlier this week, and I'm nice to see that she made it home safely. I'm going to focus primarily on reflections on Kofi Annan's legacy in UN reform, and I'm going to make that the focus, but I have a few other reflections I'd like to contribute as well. Kofi Annan touched many people throughout the world with his quiet but persistent diplomacy on behalf of humankind, and he stands out among former UN Secretaries General for his vision, his humility, and his inspiring leadership. Kofi Annan played an unusually important role in initiating and facilitating significant UN reform efforts when he served as Secretary General. And while UN reform is a constant, continuing, and never-ending process, I want to take a few moments today to reflect on his important contributions to significant UN reform while he served as Secretary General. But before I do so, I'd like to offer a few personal reflections on his relatively recent engagements with our community here in Geneva. We at the Graduate Institute Geneva, and I'm pleased to see several distinguished alumni in the audience and on this program, we are extremely proud to be able to claim Kofi Annan as one of our most distinguished alumni. He pursued a postgraduate degree with us at the Institute in the 1960s after graduating from Macalester College in the United States. And every time he visited our campus for a public event over the past few years, whether it was a speech, an award ceremony, hosting a meeting of the elders, or his recent interview with the BBC's Zainal Badawi on the occasion of his 80th birthday just last April. He was received by throngs of enthusiastic students here. His reception was more like that of a rock star than of a seasoned international diplomat. He always had time for individual one-on-one interactions with our students and our colleagues, and he was an inspiration to our entire community. And as a result, we tried not to overtax his generous goodwill with us, but we were always receptive to initiatives for launches of reports from the important work of the Kofi Annan Foundation, located just up the block from us on the way to the UN headquarters here in Geneva. But let me go beyond those initial personal just reflections of some recent interactions to talk about Kofi Annan's legacy with United Nations reform, because it can be traced back to his very first days in office. As has already been mentioned, as the very first UN Secretary General to come up through the ranks of the extraordinarily complex organization, he knew well both the strengths and the weaknesses of the UN organization. And shortly after assuming office in 1997, Kofi Annan issued a report on management and organizational measures that called for a strengthened cabinet-style executive management team for the Secretary General's office. Just a few months later, again in his first year, he released the report, quote, titled Renewing the United Nations, a Program for Reform, which called for further reforms, including the creation of the Deputy Secretary General position, the consolidation of disparate in-country programs under a single office at the national level, reaching out to civil society and to business actors, and a number of important administrative and financial reductions. But his contributions to UN reform went far beyond mundane, even if important, administrative reforms. And in substantive terms, he used the occasion of the coming Millennium in 2000 to launch the Millennium Summit and the Millennium Development Goals in 2000, which were intended, as he said at the time, to, quote, put people at the center of everything we do. The 8 goals focused on tangible, material improvements in living standards, with special emphasis on hunger, health, education, gender equality, development partnerships, and sustainability. But beyond the Millennium Development Goals, which might be a significant achievement for any Secretary General, recognizing that, again, quoting Kofi Annan, the goals of the United Nations and those of business can indeed be mutually supportive, he proposed at a World Economic Forum meeting that the private sector and that the United Nations initiate a global compact of shared values and principles, which will give a human face to the global market. The sometimes controversial set of partnerships with major business enterprises worldwide, controversial at least from the standpoint of some advocacy non-governmental organizations. But this initiative was motivated by both political economic realism in a time of dwindling financial resources for the UN, and it was also guided by a set of principles developed with the assistance of noted international relations scholar and former UN Assistant Secretary General John Ruggie. Indeed, it was a good example of productive and constructive alliances between the UN and the Academy that created the possibility of new forms of institutional governance. Public-private partnerships have taken off exponentially since the early 2000s and today provide the UN with sources of finance, information, technological access, mechanisms of dissemination of both ideas and of services. Another important reform innovation initiated under Kofi Annan's leadership at the UN was the establishment of the Global Fund. Focused initially on the devastating consequences of epidemics such as HIV/AIDS, the Global Fund today is a partnership, an extension of the Global Compact idea into the realm of global health, focused on HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. Kofi Annan proposed the creation of the fund, which has mobilized significant funding from private philanthropic foundations like the Gates Foundation, among others. And today it engages government, civil society, the private sector, and importantly, the people affected by the diseases. It's a genuine multi-stakeholder initiative, raising and investing nearly $4 billion a year to support programs run by local experts in countries and communities most in need. Again, another important achievement that again would distinguish most secretaries general, but perhaps the most far-reaching set of reforms mentioned by Andy Knight was to come a few years later with the commissioning of the high-level panel on threats, challenges, and change in 2003, and their production of a report published in 2004 titled On a More Secure World, Our Shared Responsibility. The panel of eminent persons drawn from around the world focused on developing a vision for the UN for the 21st century. And their report spanned the range of major issues, from the development of criteria for intervention to the creation of an architecture for UN peacebuilding, reform of the Human Rights Commission, and the need for major reform of the peak institution of the UN organization, the UN Security Council. And not just the need for its reform, but concrete ideas about different models of reform. In his subsequent commentary on the document in 2005, again just referred to a moment ago, the document In Larger Freedom Towards Development, Security, and Human Rights for All, Kofi Annan drew on Franklin Roosevelt's 4 freedoms speech, particularly freedom from want and freedom from fear. But he also added freedom to live with dignity. To articulate the need for major reform of the UN system in its entirety, he said, and I quote, "I have named the present report In Larger Freedom to insist the enduring relevance of the Charter of the United Nations and to emphasize that its purposes must be advanced in the lives of individual men and women. The notion of larger freedom also encapsulates the idea that development, security, and human rights go hand in hand." And in preparation for this, I reread, or not all of it, but much of the document, and it is really quite a striking statement. He re-articulated the Millennium Development Goals in the section devoted to freedom from want. He assessed progress in their achievement between 2000 and 2005, and he discussed ways of implementing them at both the national and the international level. In his discussion of freedom from fear, he articulated the need for important reforms of existing institutions working on issues of counterterrorism and nuclear proliferation. But he also advocated the idea of building an architecture for peace building within the UN system, to move beyond crisis management and peacekeeping interventions to the construction of longer-term lasting peace or positive peace. In the section devoted to freedom to live with dignity, he emphasized the need for significant reform of the UN Commission on Human Rights. He endorsed the principle of responsibility to protect, again, as just spoken about by Andy Knight. And he also supported the idea of the creation of a democracy fund and better coordination within the UN with regard to the provision of electoral assistance. And not to, as I think just a comment just a moment ago about despite all the humility and empathy, he was someone who was no pushover. He also took on head-on the need for reform of both the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council. Indeed, he called upon the General Assembly to rationalize its work and speed up the deliberative process, to concentrate on addressing major substantive issues of the day, and to establish mechanisms enabling it to engage fully and systematically with civil society. With regard to the Security Council, he declared that, quote, "No reform of the United Nations would be complete without reform of the Security Council." He urged member states to consider the 2 options laid out in the report of the high-level panel on threats, challenges, and change. Either create 6 new permanent seats with no veto being created, and 3 new 2-year terms for non-permanent seats divided among the major regional areas, or create a new category of 8 4-year renewable term seats and 1 new 2-year non-permanent and non-renewable seat, again, divided among the major regional areas. So it wasn't just a matter of you need to reform, but endorsing some of the concrete proposals that came out of the high-level panel report. Many of the core elements of this, it's a radical program of reforms, were included in the historic World Summit Outcome document, adopted unanimously by the UN General Assembly in September of 2005. The UN Commission on Human Rights was replaced by the Human Rights Council with its innovative system of universal periodic review of all member states. A Peacebuilding Commission and Peacebuilding Support Office were established in New York. There was universal acceptance, at least in principle, if not in subsequent practice, of the idea of responsibility to protect. And according to one of the architects of the text at the time, former Assistant Secretary General and Special Advisor to Kofi Annan, Stephen Stedman, quote, "These are the most far-reaching reforms in 60 years." Though he was quick to add, "God knows there's not much competition." But in the end, of course, major Security Council reform remained off the agenda, as it does to this day. But on a more encouraging note, Kofi Annan's call for reforms of the working methods of the Security Council have been assiduously pursued by groups of so-called like-minded states, trying to make the decision-making processes of the UN Security Council more efficient and more transparent. One other important reform initiated by Kofi Annan had to do with the day-to-day operations of the UN at the country level, because both in 1997 and 2002 and in his commentary on in Larger Freedom, Kofi Annan called for, quote, "improving our work at the country level, particularly by strengthening the resident coordinator system." And although the concept of one UN is sometimes dismissed by cynics within the organization, Kofi Annan's recognition of the need for greater system coherence came out of his own experience and knowledge of the challenges of field operations of the organization, and the lasting influence of this reform is influence throughout the organization to the present day. So let me conclude with some reflections on education and partnerships with academic institutions. Again, an issue that's already been mentioned by some of the previous speakers. Kofi Annan once said, quote, "Knowledge is power. Information is liberating. Education is the premise of progress in every society and in every family." And throughout his career, Kofi Annan supported scholarly engagement with the UN system. I've already mentioned his appointment of leading scholars of international organizations like John Ruggie to positions of authority and influence within the UN. It started with John, but continued with many others, including Michael Doyle, Ed Luck, Jennifer Welsh, Steve Stedman, and I could list others. But he also offered support to academic research institutions, as he did for us at the Watson Institute at Brown University in the US, when he took the time to record a video for us to screen at the dedication of our new building, due to, I think, the history of our research on humanitarian intervention pioneered by my former colleague, Tom Weiss. And then finally, on a personal note, I was very deeply honored by his willingness to offer an endorsement of my recent book on UN targeted sanctions, even though I knew it was written on a subject about which he had strong reservations and, quite frankly, limited enthusiasm. Nonetheless, he generously wrote that he hoped that policymakers would review the valuable lessons of experience put forward in the book when they consider any future sanctions regimes. And I think it's really testimony to his enduring commitment to creating partnerships for the improvement of the UN and the people it serves. In this instance, partnerships with the academic community to deliver on the promise that knowledge is power and that information indeed can be liberating. Kofi Annan was a pioneer in the pursuit of institutional reform, and he achieved more constructive reform in his 2 terms as Secretary General than most of his predecessors or successors combined. And I can say personally, we will miss his presence in Geneva, but his spirit lives on through his foundation and its many important initiatives. Thank you again for inviting me to participate, and thank you for your attention.
Good afternoon, colleagues, distinguished panelists. My name is Philip Duconsey, and I'm speaking from Accra. It is heartwarming to meet our colleagues, even though virtually, but quite stimulating so far. I've been given a topic to treat, and it's Kofi Annan, a Ghanaian perspective and contribution to African development. And it is important to place Kofi Annan within a certain context as far as Africa is concerned. Africa is the region that has always been looked upon as a region of doom and gloom, where you have this bottomless pit, where we've actually poured millions of dollars of aid, and we have seen very little for it. But it is important to know that Mr. Annan believed in Africa, and he was a utmost African and a Ghanaian. We appreciated his peace-building, peacemaking initiatives, his love for human security and rule of law and long-term development as such. He's seen as a colossal developer, yet a very humble man with great humility, with deep insights and thoughtfulness about specific ways of addressing the development problematic that developing countries are faced with. He is also seen in Africa and in Ghana as the ultimate public servant and peacemaker. Indeed, it is out of this that the Ashanti people, through the Asantehene Tumfo Osei Tutu, conferred on him the title Busumru, and Busumru is basically the sword that Asante kings hold to swear allegiance and swear service and commitment to the Ashanti people. And so Busumru, the title conferred on Kofi, was actually a reflection of Kofi's importance and his thoughtfulness in terms of providing ideas towards development and charting paths that few have dared to chart, even though they had the authority and power to do so. So Mr. Annan was someone who was highly loved by Ghanaians and Africans, and this was so because of his personality, which some of the panelists have actually described quite vividly. His contribution to African development comes in so many ways, but it can be summed up in terms of his contribution to peace building and peacekeeping, his work towards development, whether short, medium, or long term, and his contribution in particular towards educational development in Africa. So I would like to speak a bit about his concept of development. Mr. Annan's concept of development was global in perspective, encompassing the need for policy focus on human security, human dignity, promoting equality of humanity, and engendered education, development with results and effectiveness. Kofi Annan believed in making an impact in the local area, so to speak, brighten the corner where you are. And he felt that by making contributions at the international level, he would have been serving Africa in that regard. Mr. Annan made serious contributions towards African development, especially through his commitment and work towards relieving and also helping families who have been affected or actually people suffering from AIDS. His work on AIDS has been highlighted by some of the earlier presenters. But it is important to note that an aspect of Mr. Annan's work was his initiative towards the resolution of both transient and intractable African political conflicts in terms of challenges with leadership change and transitions, as well as fashioning new political institutions. And we remember his work with Kenya and with Zimbabwe, even with Ghana. In Kenya, where after an election, the Kenyans actually decided to engage in some serious local battles, killing over 1,000 persons. And with the support of Mr. Annan, managed to think through new approaches to governing, whereby there was sharing of power between opposition and the majority party. That model worked quite well to the extent that within the time frame that this particular approach was adopted, the Kenyan government managed to review its constitution and also to introduce a level of decentralization unknown to the country before. Then you come to Zimbabwe and you come to Ghana as well. What was so interesting was the need for the international community to support African countries, especially in times when we were at the brink of war because of lack of understanding and lack of appreciation for the sharing of power, whether at the national level or at the local level. And he also assisted the people of Zimbabwe to create a power-sharing government to the extent that there was some relative calm in that country for a while. Then we turn our attention to a country like Ghana, somewhere in 2016, when the country went for its general elections, and for a matter of about 4 or 5 days, we were not hearing from the electoral commissioner who had actually won. And Mr. Annan, in his quiet way, put in a word or two, and we saw that soon after his intervention, the opposition party that seemingly had lost the elections conceded defeat, and there was calm return to the country. So Mr. Annan's contribution to the resolution of political conflicts cannot be underestimated at all. Then we look at other enduring problems, such as happened in Darfur in Sudan, the challenges with the Sudan itself, South Sudan and mainland Sudan, and all the negotiations and diplomatic efforts that were required to improve on the processes towards peace, reconciliation, and ultimately towards independence and self-determination for the people of South Sudan. Then, even in the same light, we come to West Africa, and you look at Mr. Annan's work as peacemaker, peace builder in the war in Sierra Leone and in Liberia, the establishment of ECOMOG in Liberia that brought a semblance of peace and restoration of political governance to a country that had been war-torn for a decade. All these testify to Mr. Annan's efforts as an international peacemaker and a son of Africa who wished his continent well. Then we move on to the contribution made by Mr. Annan towards long-lasting resolution of conflict in Africa, the establishment of the International Criminal Court, and a court that is somehow derogatorily spoken about as an African court, in the sense that the majority of the cases is tried and of course the most important cases the International Criminal Court has tried have been important conflicts in Africa, and with cases referred to the International Criminal Court by either the international community or the countries themselves or citizens within the country. We saw Mr. Annan's contribution in the establishment of the International Criminal Court as his way of helping Africa to overcome the issue of lack of internal credibility of our institutions. Africans, though we had our own Supreme Courts and other high courts within our own jurisdictions, issues and cases of serious conflicts and horror meted out on peoples were concerned, you hardly found people who could stand up and defend the poor. Mr. Annan took on that role as a defender of the poor by helping in establishing the International Criminal Court, also helping the international community to adopt the norm of responsibility to protect in that regard. So Mr. Annan's contribution to African political life and also African development cannot be underestimated at all. Mr. Annan's contribution also focused similarly on issues of border disputes. And initially I mentioned that there have been a number of intractable problems. You go into the African development literature. Intractability has been an issue spoken about quite widely and written about in the 1980s in particular. And Mr. Annan's contribution to border disputes, especially the Nigerian-Cameroonian crisis over the Bakassi Peninsula in 2006, was quite impressive in the sense that this had been a problem area between the two countries for decades since independence. And it was heartwarming to see Mr. Annan's diplomacy at its highest, intervening and brokering peace that has underpinned the resolution of that conflict once and for all. So we see Mr. Annan as that great African leader who, if he had not appeared, probably we would have had a lot of challenges indeed. And then we look at the broader international development contribution made by Mr. Annan through the Millennium Development Goals, the Millennium Summit, and all the fundraising efforts that went with it. The MDGs, as we had them, basically were, I think, more relevant to Africa than other continents. In that regard, it helped consolidate decades of vacillation, decades of promise and fail. Here we had this international development agenda properly codified with about 189 countries signing up to it, and then being adopted locally in Africa and in Ghana also as an important development documents that underpin most of the national programs that governments adopted since the year 2000. Remember, we had the Lagos Plan of Action in the early 1980s, and which were not really implemented because of the lack of resources. But of course, the Millennium Development Goals provided an avenue through which some forms of international fundraising could be geared towards African development in a very significant way. So in that regard, Mr. Annan's legacy for long-term development has been secured. Let us come to Mr. Annan's contribution to Ghanaian development as such. After his tenure of office as UN Secretary General, Mr. Annan devoted quite a lot of time to governance, strengthening governance institutions within Ghana and within Africa as a whole. Mr. Annan contributed towards a number of programs, including the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, his involvement with climate change, a fight for rule of law and human rights have all been credited to Mr. Annan as the great champion of development, not only in Ghana, but in Africa and the world as a whole. Mr. Annan's contribution to Ghana after his retirement from the UN is summarized in his contribution towards education, both primary, secondary, and tertiary. He became the Chancellor of the University of Ghana, enhancing the research profile of the University of Ghana by raising funds, especially from the Carnegie Foundation, and helping the University of Ghana set up an Office of Research, Innovation, and Development. And this has not been a mean feat, because from that exercise, the University of Ghana emerged as the 8th in Africa in a recent league table that have been compiled, all reflecting the effort that Mr. Annan put in terms of supporting the establishment of research funding for proper long-term science-based research in Ghana. He also established a number of linkages with local school-based organizations. His own Mfantsipim School enjoyed his contributions and his patronage, encouraging the youth in Ghana to take up leadership in spite of whether they are old or not. He saw them as leaders and encouraged them to take up leadership and do development, do things in ways that will change the communities in which people found themselves. The establishment of the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center in Ghana is also a significant contribution to the developmental agenda of Mr. Annan. This institution has grown, and it has produced graduates at a postgraduate level in peacekeeping and in international politics and defense, gender and defense, and a whole lot of other programs that have been undertaken. And recently, it's my institute that mentors this center, the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping training center. And we have seen this small institute grow to even seek accreditation towards providing PhD programming for the people who come to this institute. So on the whole, I think that Mr. Annan's contribution to Africa probably was greater than his contribution seen internationally, because we felt it quite palpably in the sense that from the levels of development and the levels of achievement in terms of economic development and human development, most African countries, even as they belong to the list of least developing countries, found a lot of inspiration from the leadership provided by Mr. Annan, and therefore used his leadership and the opportunities provided by him for various institutions to do themselves well by lifting up their own standards and ensuring that whatever they produce lived up to a certain standard. So Mr. Annan, one of his enduring legacies to Africa was his continuous emphasis on the fact that the human being is prone to perpetual renewal of horror, the term he has used quite significantly, and that there is always the need for African leaders to take the initiative and lead their people in ways that will lift them out of the horrors that continue to recur. And hence, some of his last acts was his joining what we call the Council of Elder Statesmen in Africa, working with the likes of Nelson Mandela and the president of Algeria and other personalities, Grassa Machel, and making his sterling contribution to the resolution of African problems, both transient, medium, and long term. And it is in this light that those of us in Ghana and in Africa appreciate the work that Mr. Annan has done. In terms of his legacy, he is unmatched, and it is very difficult to find someone who can fill Mr. Annan's shoes in the next 10, 20 years. It will take us a whole long time to find an international statesman who was at the same time local and made the level of impact that he has made in the lives of Africans. So on this note, I will end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody, and so say all of us. Here, I fully endorse the conclusions of our previous speakers. Good morning, everyone. I too am truly honored to be here, very grateful for the invitation from Professor Byron to share with all of you on the legacy, the life and legacy of the late Secretary General Kofi Annan, and I count myself among the staff members who were privileged to have served the organization under his leadership. And he continues to be an inspiration to us, even in the years that he has been in retirement, had been in retirement. And as you have appreciated this morning with the tributes that we have already received, his legacy is multifaceted, layered and textured. And we, his disciples, will be a very, very long time working to give life and meaning to his vision of what the UN, both as an organization and as a community of nations, can be, indeed must become, if all mankind is to live free from fear and free from want. And it is that objective, eloquent in its simplicity, that encapsulated Kofi Annan's ardent ambition to change the global development paradigm. It was he who, in his groundbreaking treatise on the role of the UN in the 21st century, articulated a compelling, far-reaching, inclusive, people-centered movement for unprecedented change in the quality of life of every global citizen, that mankind may live free from fear and free from want. This, in fact, was the essence of the concept of human security that he espoused. That there could be no development without security, and no security without development. And that we would enjoy neither of these without respect for human rights. He argued that development, security, and human rights were not merely ends in themselves. They reinforced each other. They depended on each other. He placed defense of human rights at the center of his mission to create a better world for us to live in. He affirmed the principle that human rights were universal and indivisible. He demanded that equal attention be given to those rights, whether civil, political, social, economic, or cultural, including the right to development. From this premise, it is easy to understand what motivated and guided the actions of this exceptional leader, one who had the added advantage of having risen through the ranks of the organization. For when Kofi Annan assumed the helm of the UN in 1996, he had already given 34 years, with the exception of the two mentioned by Mr. Dumas, 34 years of his entire career to the United Nations system. He joined in 1962 when the organization was completely diverted by the crosswinds of the Cold War, relegating to the periphery other key missions articulated in the Charter of the United Nations, like social and economic development and the broader humanitarian aspirations. So he had the benefit of introspection over time of how much more the UN could do and be in the service of mankind. He therefore assumed the responsibilities of Secretary General with clear understanding and unwavering resolve to transform the United Nations into a force for good. It is not surprising, therefore, that of the 30 special sessions of the United Nations held by the UN since its establishment to date, that's 73 years, 10 of those 30 were convened during Secretary General Annan's tenure. Special sessions offer an opportunity for the world body to focus on a specific issue considered to be deserving of special attention outside of the regular sessions of the UN. Special sessions convened under S.G. Annan's leadership clearly reflected the development and welfare agenda that he was using to rebalance and renew the overarching mission of the UN. There were special sessions on social development, on children, on women and gender equality, on population and development, on the problem of HIV/AIDS, on the world drug problem, a review of the Earth Summit, a review of the Barbados Program of Action on SIDS, on habitat. And there were world conferences as well. The Monterey Conference on Financing for Development, the Johannesburg Summit on Sustainable Development, the Mauritius International Meeting on SIDS, to name a few. I will address the Millennium Summit separately. But with his quiet, compelling demeanor and restrained passion, he lent his considerable influence to the airing of the widest possible range of development issues under the auspices of the United Nations. Pursuit of human security became the foundation of his comprehensive strategy to achieve human development. And tackling poverty in particular was at the heart of that strategy. He described poverty as an affront to our common humanity that also makes other problems worse. He was concerned at the degree of income inequality, both within and between states. He was especially concerned with the people of sub-Saharan Africa, living in the misery of extreme poverty and lacking the capacity and the resources to improve their situation. He argued that the deprivation and despair that attended these circumstances would fuel unrest and strife. In the years leading to the start of the 21st century, many other issues associated with the need for attention to human security and human rights attracted the attention of Secretary General Annan. He called for greater attention to be given to promoting a disability perspective in policies and programs as we pursue what he described as a society for all. He described the trend in world aging as a silent revolution, noting in particular the significant gender dimension to the aging process, considering that women are living longer than men and are more likely than men to be poor in old age. He called for a multi-generational society for all ages, one committed to creating an environment that responds to disability, discrimination, marginalization as people age. He drew attention to the heavy indebtedness of many developing countries, particularly the LDCs and the SIDS, and noted with disquiet the steady declining levels of ODA, of official development assistance from donor countries, notwithstanding commitments made to maintain contributions at 0.7% of GDP. He expressed concern at the devastating impact of small arms on civilian populations, linked as they were to violence associated with terrorism and organized crime. He identified these arms as a real threat to human security. These activities, no doubt, contributed to clarifying his vision on how best to reshape approaches to international development, peace and security, with we the peoples, rather than nations, as the focus. This vision he articulated in the seminal work launched at the Millennium Summit, which transformed international perception of global responsibility. Tellingly, he used the premise and point of departure as the emergence of the impact of globalization, which offered a new context for and a new connectivity among economic actors and activities across the world, facilitated by technology and the dismantling of barriers to trade and capital mobility. Globalization was the insidious phenomenon, pushing income and other inequalities, social dislocation, and vulnerability. He posited compellingly that to thrive and survive, a global economy must have a more solid foundation in shared values and institutional practices. It must advance broader and more inclusive social purpose. Globalization had forced a reshaping of global discourse and interaction. And so he concludes that if we are to capture the promises of globalization while managing its adverse effects, we must learn to govern better, and we must learn how better to govern together. The unique role of the United Nations in the new global era derives from our universal membership and scope and from the shared values embodied in our charter. It is our job to ensure that globalization provides benefits, not just for some, but for all. That peace and security hold, not only for a few, but for many. That opportunities exist, not merely for the privileged, but for every human being everywhere. And this is the introduction to the document, We the Peoples. This exhortation to global citizenship, including the duality of straight action implicit, is at the core of the late S.G. Kofi Annan's global development legacy. He called the global community to account, given persistent inequalities exacerbated by globalization, and he extracted a commitment from the global community to address these inequities, working together to achieve a common good that should positively impact the well-being of every global citizen. The 8 Millennium Development Goals, which received much attention at their adoption, are relegated to a footnote now, having been replaced by the Sustainable Development Goals, the more far-reaching Sustainable Development Goals. But the impetus behind the global commitment that drives SDG implementation across the world belongs to Secretary General Annan. And that commitment was not limited to state action alone. It was under S.G. Annan's leadership that diversification of development partners proliferated. The high level of engagement of civil society, academia, and the private sector is taken for granted in the UN today, but it was nurtured under Secretary Annan's leadership. He encouraged a closer engagement with luminaries like Jeffrey Sachs and Joseph Stiglitz, the United Nations Foundation. We heard about other foundations from other panelists, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in support of MDG and SDG initiatives are all prominent examples of Annan's advocacy, mobilizing resources for development. Indeed, the Global Compact Initiative today remains the most significant effort promoting corporate social responsibility, also a brainchild of the late S.G. Annan. There can be no doubt that S.G. Kofi Annan has indeed left an indelible mark on the United Nations. For many years to come, we will be working to implement his ideas and initiatives. His most enduring qualities were his profound humanity, his love of people, and his solidarity with those in need, the vulnerable and the voiceless. He will be missed for his wise counsel, on which so many relied, but more so for his calm unflappability, which often masked his steely determination to get things done. He was much loved and respected by the staff of the UN, who also, by the way, remember the personal care and concern that he demonstrated regarding their own welfare and that of their families. I have to mention that among the reforms that he implemented was the establishment of the Office of the Ombudsman, to ensure that staff had a resource and a sounding board to address the concerns and challenges of the service that they faced. And he selected a daughter of the Caribbean, our Ambassador Patricia Durant, as the first ombudsman of the United Nations system. The late S.G. Kofi Annan visited the Epcot Center in 1998, and he was taken with a plaque in the welcome area which asserted, "Here human achievements are celebrated." It is our hope that this place will instill a new sense of belief and pride in man's ability to shape a world that offers hope to people everywhere. There should be no surprise that those words resonated with him. for they could have been his own while standing in the building at 42nd Street. In the words of our Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, he will be remembered not only as an extraordinary statesman, a remarkable diplomat, and inspiring leader, but above all, for his gentleness, his warmth, and his friendship. And may he rest in peace.
Let me say how delighted I am to have been invited to participate in this discussion honoring the life and legacy of Mr. Kofi Annan, the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations. Firstly, as a graduate of the Institute of International Relations, I am happy to be back thanks to the kind invitation of Professor Jessica Byron. I also wish to thank her team for the excellent arrangements. Secondly, having spent a significant part of my UN career in disarmament and peacekeeping, I am delighted at the opportunity to share my thoughts on Mr. Kofi Annan's work in these two fields. While Mr. Annan's tenure at the UN impacted many aspects of international affairs, as the preceding speakers have shown, my aim is to address Mr. Annan's contribution as a peacemaker and his role and impact on disarmament, a key ingredient of all peacekeeping efforts. Before discussing Mr. Annan's work in the context of peace, security, and disarmament, it is necessary to say a few words about the United Nations' vision for disarmament. The UN, first and foremost, seeks to promote global norms of disarmament as contained in existing treaties, instruments, and other multilateral arrangements. These global norms are vital to the sustainable development, the quality of life, and ultimately the very survival of our planet. The need for such norms arose directly from the legacy of the last century of wars and preparation for wars. As you can imagine, the costs of these past conflicts have been extraordinarily high, with the loss of millions of innocent lives. Weapons of mass destruction, along with excess stocks and illicit transfers of conventional arms, jeopardize international peace and security and works against other goals of the United Nations Charter, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals. The UN believes that the potential effects of the use of weapons of mass destruction, especially nuclear weapons, calls for their elimination. The philosophy underpinning such disarmament is that the very possession of weapons of any kind, including weapons of mass destruction, entails the risk of their use. The UN therefore works to assist member states and civil society in efforts to eliminate such arms. As you will see from the following discussion, Mr. Annan worked tirelessly before, during, and after his assignment as Secretary General to advance the UN's mandates on peace and security. It was through Mr. Annan's initiatives in the late 1990s that the United Nations first began to reach out to civil society to form very effective partnerships for disarmament and peace. As Mr. Annan often acknowledged, disarmament by itself cannot ensure domestic or international peace and security. The root causes of conflict must also be effectively addressed through preventive measures in order for disarmament and peace to be sustainable. The elimination of weapons of mass destruction, illicit arms trafficking, and weapons stockpiles would greatly advance both peace and development goals and should always be pursued in parallel with preventive measures addressing the root causes of conflict. Effective disarmament reduces the effects of wars eliminates some key incentives for new conflicts, and most importantly, frees resources to improve the lives of all people and protects their natural environment. The basic philosophy behind disarmament is that if you reduce the availability of arms of all kinds, you will also reduce the chances of armed conflict. Mr. Annan was always a very passionate advocate for disarmament. In a speech at Princeton University in November 2006, he outlined one of the major obstacles to progress on the issue of nuclear weapons. He pointed to a total lack of any common strategy among nations who were divided into two camps: those advocating for non-proliferation first, mainly those who possess nuclear weapons, and those promoting disarmament first. Each side, he said, waits for the other to move first. The result is that mutually assured destruction has been replaced by mutually assured paralysis. Things have not changed much since that impassioned speech at Princeton. It appears, however, that many nations have listened to his dire warnings. 11 years after that Princeton speech, in July 2017, 122 states of the member states of the United Nations adopted the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. While none of the nuclear weapon states have signed or ratified the treaty, it is nevertheless a victory for persistence, a quality that also exemplified Mr. Annan's career as a peacemaker. Mr. Annan served at the helm of the United Nations Organization from 1997 to 2006 as its Secretary General at a consequential juncture in modern history. During this time, there was an escalation of internal conflicts around the world, which demanded new approaches in the way the UN handles such conflicts. Some analysts have argued in this regard that Mr. Annan's focus on guiding the UN in the direction of prevention and resolution of armed conflict within its member states, while still trying to maintain peace and security among them, was his defining legacy as a global peacemaker. Maintaining domestic peace was always a difficult task for the UN, as it involved more than just the reduction of arms supplies. Prior to Mr. Annan's term of office as Secretary General, the UN had little by way of norms and virtually no institutional capacity or political resolve to prevent deadly conflicts within states while maintaining peace between them. Mr. Annan introduced sweeping reforms to address these deficiencies when he took office in 1997. Shortly before leaving office in 2006, he issued a report to the General Assembly entitled Enlarger Freedom, with further recommendations for improving the UN's approach to addressing the challenges of international and domestic peace and security. A section of that report, Freedom from Fear, called on the nuclear weapon states to not only reduce their arsenals, but to do so irrevocably. Ever the peacemaker, he recommended the establishment of the Peacebuilding Commission as well as a Peacebuilding Support Office within the UN Secretariat, both of which are now in place and making a difference. Kofi Annan's impact on international peace and security long predated his ascent to the position of UN Secretary General. Following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, he was tasked with facilitating the repatriation of close to 1,000 international staff, as well as the release of Western hostages. He later led the first UN team negotiating with Iraq on the sale of oil to fund purchases of humanitarian aid for that country. When his predecessor, Boutros Ghali, established the Department for Peacekeeping Operations in 1992, he appointed Annan to the new department as Assistant Secretary General and later as Under Secretary General. Mr. Annan took over that department during a period of unprecedented growth in the UN's field presence. I myself participated in several of these field missions in Namibia, South Africa, Liberia, the Central African Republic, and Kosovo, to name a few. Mr. Annan was appointed Special Representative of the Secretary General in the former Yugoslavia, serving from November 1995 to March 1996. Kofi Annan's first major initiatives as Secretary General was a plan for UN reform, which included revamping peacemaking, which he presented to member states in July 1997. Mr. Annan used his office to advocate for human rights, the rule of law, development, and Africa. And he worked to bring the UN closer to the people by forging ties with civil society, the private sector, and other partners. In 2001, Mr. Annan and the United Nations were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. It was an honor he richly deserved. I believe that peacekeeping was in Mr. Annan's DNA, and what better place to demonstrate that gift than in the context of the United Nations and its mandate for peace. Even in retirement, Mr. Annan did not simply rest on his laurels. He took on the role of UN Special Envoy for Syria in response to the armed conflict which erupted there in March 2011. He also chaired an advisory commission established by Myanmar in 2016 to improve the welfare of the minority Rohingya community. Quite fittingly, an international peacekeeping training session bearing his name was established in Kofi Annan's homeland, Ghana. As an African, Mr. Annan was particularly sensitive to armed conflict in that region and the need to aggressively pursue peace and disarmament there. Shortly after becoming UN Secretary General, Mr. Annan addressed the 1997 summit meeting of the Organization of African Unity, OAU. The main thrust of his message at that summit was that Africa's peace and development required African leaders to hold one another more accountable on how they manage their domestic affairs, especially the protection of human rights. Since delivering that address, all African governments are now obligated to hold regular periodic national elections. They are also obliged to invite the African Union to send teams of observers to monitor and judge whether these elections were a true reflection of the popular will. Most notably, his 1997 address to the OAU called for civil society to play its part. This reflected what was to become one of his major innovations as UN Secretary General, his willingness to reach out, listen to, and cooperate with, and adopt some of the policies advocated by civil society. And now, to conclude on a personal note, I had the opportunity to meet Mr. Annan on a few occasions in the context of my work in disarmament. I was privileged to have prepared some of his talking points for meetings with government officials, and as the designated note taker at some of these meetings, it was always an honor to be in the presence of the Peacemaker Extraordinaire. He was truly an endearing inspiration to all, especially those of us staff from Africa and the African diaspora. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we do have some time to take some questions or comments. So the floor is now open. If you are asking a question or making a comment, please identify yourself. We will take a round of questions and then I will ask our panelists to reply as they see fit. Shall we do it like that? I think that there is a mic somewhere. So if anybody cares to make a comment, just indicate and the mic will come to you. Or have we exhausted you and you have no more energy? Yes, sir.
Hello, good morning once again to the panel, and thank you for your respective and excellent contributions. My name is Anthony Gafour. I'm a research PhD student at the Institute right here in Trinidad. I particularly wanted to get the panel's perspective on Mr. Annan's role, not just, of course, as a UN peacekeeper, but as an international mediator, because his record in that regard, I think, is renowned, not just as Secretary General, which has traditionally been looked to assist in that regard, but really in terms of some of the key disputes that he has assisted with in resolving as a mediator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justice Gafour. Are there other questions?
It's kind of in a rough form.
It is, yes, there are two.
Gail Guy, formerly of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. My interest is the human side. We have heard calm, quiet, unflappable, always in sartorial elegance, the quintessential diplomat. These are the adjectives I've heard this morning. What, in the view of the panelists, makes a diplomat stand out in the way that Kofi Annan has in his time? So I want you to relate those, the qualities that I mentioned and the others that you mentioned in terms of the person. What was significant about those qualities in the historical period?
Thank you very much, Ms. Guy. Ambassador Francis.
Yes. Good afternoon. Recently, there was a statement issued by the current National Security Advisor to the US President. It was a reaction to a statement released, I think maybe 5 weeks or so ago, by the International Criminal Court on the possibility of the court examining the conduct of the United States in Afghanistan and Iraq from the perspective of matters under the jurisdiction of the court. That is, egregious human rights abuses, etc. And there was a very acerbic response issued by the US National Security Advisor that more or less stated that insofar as the US government is concerned, the court does not exist. Now, the United States, as is known, is not a member of the court. But in the setting up of the court has jurisdiction to act not just among its members, but among all of the international community, wherever egregious crimes have been committed or thought to have been committed against humanity. And so I wanted the panel to address, if it could, what would be Kofi Annan's likely reaction to, I think I know it, but it would be interesting to get the perspective of the panel on what appears to be an attempt by the current US administration not merely to invalidate the court, but also implying the possibility of sanctions against those governments that cooperate with the court or support the court in its attempt to bring into focus possible breaches of international human rights and international humanitarian law by operatives acting in the name of and on behalf of the US government in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. That is quite a question, quite a statement. Do we have one more before we ask the panel for comments?
Yes, I think we have heard some very interesting comments on the work of Kofi Annan, and the conclusion that I tend to draw is that his work has been positive in a net way. There are negatives and there are failures, and possibly the one that tends to come to my mind the most is the Rwanda crisis, in which 800,000 people died. Today, the biggest genocide we have known in modern history, and out of which came this R2P thing that Professor Knight spoke about. Now, I think it was Professor Knight, I'm not exactly sure, who said Kofi Annan did the utmost. I think he tried the best to get the powers that be to intervene, and he spent about 3 months before the crisis erupted to get the world powers to send an intervention force. I think Bill Clinton has gone down on record as saying that this has been the worst scar on his record, on his performance as a president, because he at the time had to make that decision and he didn't make it. My question really is that to what extent one can still attribute failure here to the UN or to Kofi Annan, okay, or does it entirely fall on the member states, or the UN Security Council, that there was a collapse here, there was a major failure here, because that has been a really scar on the UN and on multilateralism during his period of time.
And that question came from Dr. Anthony Gonzalez,
Gonzalez,
past lecturer and director of the Institute of International Relations. Well, I think the panel has 4 pretty interesting questions to respond to. How are we going to do this? I think, well, I can see Andy is primed to go on R2P, and I think there are a few others who would want to respond as well. So let us do it. Let us do it in sequence. Andy, you want to start the ball rolling?
Yes. I can comment on the Rwanda situation first, because I think, although that was the last question, thank you very much, Professor Gonzalez. I will try to answer that question. To a large extent, I think Kofi Annan looked at this particular travesty as one of a very troubling situation for him personally. He recognized that it was a major failure on the part of the United Nations, and particularly the UN peacekeeping operation. But at the same time, he understood the context in which this was happening. And I think I mentioned in my talk, having seen what happened in the failed state of Somalia, and the way in which the United States military was treated there, it was understandable that the United States did not want to get involved in any other conflict in Africa around that time. And I think that was one of the things that was made very clear at the time by the President of the United States. It's interesting that you mentioned that Bill Clinton, as president, felt that that was one of the biggest failings as president of the United States, that the United States allowed something like this to happen when they could have done something about it. I really don't put a lot of blame on Kofi Annan personally, even although he was in that position as Under Secretary General for UN Peacekeeping. I think a lot of the blame has to be placed squarely on the United Nations Security Council. It was the United Nations Security Council that should have acted. And of course, this is a big problem that we have with the absence of United Nations reform, as Thomas mentioned earlier. The failure to reform the United Nations has led to this sort of activity happening. So I don't place the blame on Kofi Annan as a civil servant at that time. He was trying to do his best. But I think he considered it to be a personal failing on his part, not to be able to nudge the great powers to do something about the genocide before it happened. Lots of blame has to go to a number of places, but I believe that the United States in particular has to shoulder a lot of the responsibility for this. And in some ways, this sort of leads into one of the other questions having to do with Mr. Bolton and the National Security Advisor to the United States President. As you know, I followed Mr. Bolton when he was back in the days of the Heritage Foundation. And, you know, as far as he's concerned, the world would be a much better place without the United Nations. So he has no love for the United Nations. He's always been a thorn in the side of the United Nations. When he was appointed as ambassador to the United Nations, he wasn't even approved by the U.S. Government to be in that position I believe by the Congress. But he's always had this hate relationship to the UN. And I think that's just spilled over now in this new position that he's in, where he carries a fair amount of influence over the President of the United States. The International Criminal Court, while the United States is not a member of that court, I believe it has a legitimacy because of the fact that it has been approved by a fairly large number of states within the system. But it really poses a problem for the United Nations as an international body. The inability of the organization to deal with crimes that may have been committed by the largest member of the organization, the United States. It makes it look as though the ICC is a court for the developing countries, I think as Philip might have pointed out earlier. In other words, to deal with crimes being committed in Africa and Asia and some of the other smaller regions of the world, rather than the major powers like the United States, France, and Britain. So this is something that has to be addressed, and it has to be addressed. I think the only way it can be addressed really is the acknowledgement that the International Criminal Court has a responsibility for dealing with crimes against humanity, war crimes, ethnic cleansing committed by any member state of the United Nations, whether they're a member of the ICC or not. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Professor Knight. At this point, I'd like to ask Ms. Corliss, Ambassador Corliss, if you would like to make a statement on anything. I'm sorry, I've interrupted your drink, because I know that you have a timeline, you have a deadline. So I don't know if you wished to respond to any of the questions.
Thank you very much. I'd like to respond to the to the question of Ms. Guy regarding the ability and the courage that it takes to address the challenges presented to a leader who is buffeted by opposing forces much of the time, and the importance of diplomacy and advocacy in those circumstances. I'm not certain that he was trained formally as a diplomat as we were, but certainly he learned it in his years at the UN, and I believe he is one of those that was fearless, absolutely unafraid to speak truth to power. I think he benefited from a centeredness that comes from a pureness in spirit based on his belief of the rightness of his objectives and his actions. I believe that made him unafraid, and that's where we speak of his steely determination that is gloved in advocacy and diplomacy, and he put on all the trappings of the erudite and sartorial diplomat as a selling point. I think that was part of his game. But you know, as Mr. Dumas says, he was fundamentally a quiet person, and therefore much of what we saw was quintessentially Kofi. But I believe that it is the centeredness of his spirit as a true humanitarian and lover of people that enabled him to stay the course and to defend his objectives with resolve and with dignity.
Mr. Dumas, would you like to add anything at this point?
Yes, thank you. A lot of, in direct response to Ms. Guy, a lot of Kofi's behavior came from his family foundation. I don't mean foundation in the sense of Ford Foundation or Gates Foundation. I'm talking about how he was brought up. Kofi's mother came from a royal house of Ghana. His father from a line of chiefs. He was brought up in a certain way, which influenced and shaped his personality. And there was a cultural background, which was very important, in that you didn't go out like a Bolton or a Trump to shoot down everybody in sight. You spoke to people, you consulted, you tried to get consensus. You had to take a decision, of course, at a certain point. But the difference, let us say, in approach between Kofi Annan and John Bolton could not be more marked. And with Bolton now working in his current job for the current boss and threatening ICC people with all kinds of sanctions if they do this, that, and the other, it tells you something about the different perceptions of what may one loosely call diplomacy. So Kofi met with people. Yes, he was quiet. Yes, he was even-tempered. Indeed, in all the time that I knew him, I saw him angry only twice. And if I didn't know him well, I would not have known he was angry. I was so startled that I actually asked him, what's wrong? And he told me. I could understand, yes, why he was angry, but you couldn't really tell if you didn't know the man quite well. You couldn't really tell that he was angry. So he always had a tight hold on his emotions, perhaps internalized things a bit too much, which could cause certain difficulties in terms of thing, and I think that affected him quite a bit in 2003, which I told you when I spoke earlier about how he looked when he arrived at Crown Point Airport in Tobago. So all of these things, but the background, I think, helped considerably in terms of the quality of diplomacy that he practiced. And he therefore was able to speak to people that another, let's say Boutros Ghali, who was more, shall we say, emotional, would have kept away from. For instance, one of his bitter enemies in the United States Senate was Jesse Helms. From the reaction, I know you know what kind of person Jesse Helms was. But Kofi picked up the phone and made an appointment to go down to Washington from New York to see Jesse Helms, to talk about how the United States Senate, which was then fairly hostile to the United Nations, should see the United Nations. It was not hostile to the United States. It wasn't the fact that people were voting against the United States that made the United Nations hostile to the United States. But if the United States was talking about democracy, then people had their views. And you could not say that because the United States was the most powerful country in the world, that therefore, and I'm afraid we're back to that now, that therefore, anything that the United States wanted, the United States had to get. And crap will smoke your pipe otherwise. But he went to see Helms, and Helms, I can't say they became friends. That would be stretching things. But certainly Helms understood and sort of backed away and said, okay, we'll do what we can to assist. Now, another person might have said, I'm not going there. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to humiliate myself by going to go on my knees to the Senate and so on. The irony, however, in the few months before he left the United Nations is this, that he proposed another reform program for the United Nations called Investing in the UN, and was accused by his own staff at the UN of pandering to Bolton, and that he was putting forward something which was in fact an American agenda and not something that was going to favor the United Nations as a whole. I think that hurt him more than a lot of things, because that was not his idea. It is not that he's a Secretary General. You have to take everybody's views into account. It wasn't that he was under the thumb of the United States, but clearly the United States, the most powerful country in the United Nations, most powerful country still in the world, you had to take their views into account. So in the Rwanda issue, yes, I heard Andy say that more blame has to attach to Bill Clinton than others, but Kofi did take it personally because he was the Under-Secretary General for Peacekeeping. He did receive a recommendation from the Canadian General in the field, Dallaire, that a preemptive strike should be made against certain arms caches that the Hutu had. And the Hutu were busy cutting off, because the Hutu are short, the Tutsi are tall, and the Hutu were busy cutting off the Tutsi's legs at the knee to bring them down to size. nearly 1 million people. They say over 800,000 people were massacred. And Kofi realized afterwards that he should have taken a different approach. He expressed remorse, for which he was attacked again by the Rwandans, because by then the Tutsi were back in office. And they said, what do you mean by remorse? 800,000 of us are dead and you're talking about remorse? But in all fairness to him, and this also shows his strength of character, he went to Rwanda. But after he became Secretary General, he went to Rwanda to apologize face to face to the people of Rwanda. He was badly treated. They shouted at him, they said all kinds of things about him. But the point is that he went there, he did not run away. And that I trace back again to his birth and upbringing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dumas. And now back to the rest of our panel. Would anybody else wish to? I see two hands. I see Professor Bierstecker. 3 hands. Okay, let us go in this order. I saw Professor Bierstecker's hand first, then Mr. Reynolds, and then Philip. Is that okay?
Yes.
Yes.
It's fine. Let me try to be very brief so there's time for the others to comment as well. Just like to enter the conversation a bit about the nature of Kofi Annan's diplomacy and the way in which he navigated effectively amongst the great powers and knew how to, and sometimes when not to take action. One of my former board members at the Watson Institute at Brown was Sir Brian Urquhart, and Sir Brian once commented at a meeting, well, the reason the UN is attributed with failure so often is because the great powers mess everything up first and then hand it over to the UN, so that the UN ends up getting residual and oftentimes the blame for the issue. So in a sense, with Rwanda, you have to put his actions and behavior within that larger context, which several other speakers have already addressed. And I think going to the first questioner, the research PhD student question about his role as an international mediator, you can see the great success that he had in Kenya, but note the case of Syria just shortly thereafter. Again, at this point, he simply spoke truth to power and said, if I'm not going to have the backing of the major powers on this, I cannot do my job effectively. And he, in fact, recognized that not only had he had difficulties there, but he also could not effectively mediate in that environment. So I think that has something to do with his navigation capabilities. And finally, briefly, I don't want to talk about John Bolton, but let me offer a word or two about John Bolton. In preparing my comments, I went back and reread parts of James Traub's book, The Best of Intentions. And there's a very long and interesting section in that book about how problematic Bolton was with regard to the World Summit Outcome document, because it's precisely where he was coming in. And interestingly enough, he was outmaneuvered at that point in time. But on the specifics relating to the ICC, Bolton basically came into the Bush administration in the early 2000s with, in fact, I believe he's the one who stated that the unsigning of the ICC signature from the Clinton administration was the greatest moment of his diplomatic life. So he's long had this particular issue with regard to the ICC. And the question about whether or not the U.S. would apply sanctions against those who take action, I doubt that it would have to, because the U.S. assiduously negotiated a large number of bilateral agreements that exempted American forces and American individuals from jurisdiction at the national level, and therefore referrals would not be allowed to the ICC. So, and to some extent, I don't see that happening anytime soon. Just a brief comment on that.
Thank you. Mr. Reynolds? Do you have your mic on, Mr. Reynolds?
Oh, let me see.
Yeah.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
You can hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Yes. Well, I'd like to come to the defense of Mr. Kofi Annan with regard to the Rwanda situation. One misconception the average layman has about the UN is that they often think that the UN is an independent body by itself that can take action on its own whenever action is required. Many people fail to understand that the United Nations is made up of a little over 200 member states. And while there are 200 member states, there are just a few major powers who have the ability and the facilities to make things happen in terms of military action to bring about a peaceful resolution when it's needed. But the UN as an organization cannot give an order for military action unless it has the backing of the major powers. That's something I wanted to point out. I believe that if Mr. Annan knew that he had the backing of the necessary major powers, he could have done something at the time. He could have given an order at the time to take military action. If you don't have the backing of the major powers, there's not a lot that the UN can do. I think Professor Bierstecker hit the nail on the head. Whenever there is a problem and something goes wrong, the first thing that the member states do is blame the UN. But in fact, I think they're really blaming themselves. But they say the UN, and the public generally doesn't know the difference between the UN and the member states. That's my opinion on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Reynolds. Shall we go now to Professor Osei?
Yes, well, thank you very much. I think Mr. Annan, he was the kind of person who was able to mix personal qualities with skill in terms of mediation approaches and actually securing some peace or some forms of agreement. And in particular, his quality of humility actually was what underpinned his apologies to the Rwandan people, as well as even acknowledging the fact that UN also could not help people in Srebrenica because of certain weaknesses. But he was always acutely aware of the shortcomings and the limitations of the United Nations, to the point that he even commented that there were times you have to deal with the devil to save lives. And this, he made that comment in reference to some of his dealings with Saddam Hussein. When he visited him, he visited Baghdad to convince him to open his palace for inspection to find out whether there were any weapons of mass destruction. But he was always acutely aware that you needed to combine skill with integrity and humility to be able to be effective in very difficult situations. And that shone through all his mediatory efforts in the different conflict zones that he visited. So in that regard, I was trying to address the lady ambassador's question that she raised. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Osei. Okay, I think at this point, unless there are any other burning questions, oh, there is a burning question. So please, yeah, we're getting a mic to you over here. So listen, this is the last chance for questions. So anybody else who has a question, please let us know.
Thank you very much. It's not burning, but I thought I should take the opportunity
Please
anyway.
do.
My name is Margaret King Rousseau, also formerly from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I served at the United Nations in the period just before Kofi Annan arrived as Secretary General. And today, this discussion has crystallized in my own mind that he indeed fueled the revival of the United Nations. Because just prior to leaving New York in 1995, in discourse with fellow government representatives, as well as secretariat members, there was a sense of despair and discouragement in that period of confusion in the post-Cold War period. And even a sense of shame. We were ashamed of the United Nations to a great extent during that period, just prior to his arrival. So this discourse has in fact crystallized in my own mind that he was in fact critical in fueling the revival of the United Nations. And if anyone wants to comment on that, to further crystallize in my own mind that that is in fact the reality, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. King Rousseau. Is there any response from our panel? Or
Starting because a lot of my early work has been on adapting the United Nations to the post-Cold War era and the revitalization of the United Nations and the reforms of the United Nations. So I've spent a lot of time trying to analyze the various types of reforms within the organization. As you know, since 1945, reform has been on the agenda almost every 5 or 10 years or whatever. It's always been constantly on the agenda. There was something different about Kofi Annan's approach to reform. One, he was able to acknowledge that the big powers had a point in some ways. The United States had a point in terms of making the organization leaner and more effective and more efficient and so on. But he also realized that he also made the member states realize that reform could be really a matter of maintaining the status quo, if you will, rather than advancing the organization to meet the new conditions of the post-Cold War period. I think what he was so effective in doing was sort of sort of painting the picture of a transformation period in which the United Nations had no choice but to adapt, but do so in a learning fashion. The organization is a learning organization, not just adapt in terms of reacting to things, to changes, but also thinking long-term in terms of what role the organization ought to play in this new environment which was filled with this promise of globalization and new ways of international cooperation, etc. He forced member states to realize that this period was different. And I think a lot of it had to do with the new millennium coming up too. We were on the brink of a new period, and the UN had to change in order to be able to sustain itself as an effective, not just an effective and efficient organization, but also a relevant organization. So he brought relevance, and I think this is part of the revitalization of the United Nations, bringing the people back in, bringing the UN closer to the people, those kinds of things. Human security as opposed to simply state security, the recognition that humans matter in terms of security. A lot of this has to do with the fact that he just happened to be in the right place at the right time in some ways, because there was a big discussion, as you know, in the field of international relations about the deepening and the broadening of security. Kofi Annan was just in the right place at the right time with his ideas of also broadening security to include all peoples and to make sure that human rights and humanitarian issues were front and center of the UN's agenda.
Thank you very much, Professor Knight. Mr. Reynolds?
I'd just like to follow up quickly on what Professor Knight just said. I believe that one of Kofi Annan's defining legacies would be the fact that he tried to include everyone in the peace project. For example, in the area of disarmament, the Arms Trade Treaty, which was adopted in 2015, was largely the result of the efforts of the civil society. And the same goes for the recent treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. These two landmark treaties were all the result, mainly the result of the efforts of civil society. So I think the fact that he, in 1997, when he took over, made efforts to include, to be more inclusive in the peace effort, that would be one of his lasting legacies in my mind.
Thank you. We the people. Okay. Well, I think that we can move towards wrapping up today's proceedings. I am going to invite to the podium one of our master's students, Mr. Obika, who will give the formal vote of thanks. But I would just like to give my own very fervent and deep-seated thanks to all our panelists today, and to my two colleagues, Dr. Shami and Dr. Montoot, who have really done the legwork in bringing this event together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Jessica Byron, the director here at the Institute of International Relations on the St. Augustine campus. My task at this point is very simple, and that is to move a vote of thanks. Just before I do so, I've been asked to inform each and every one that you are invited to the Norman Govan Library immediately upon the end of this session to view the exhibition at the library. Okay? It was just across the corridor. So on behalf of the Institute, the staff of the Norman Govan Library, the Marketing and Communications Department at the campus here, the United Nations Information Center, with respect to its input, the secretariat and staff here at the Institute, in particular, Ms. McAllister Ikana, or Ms. Ikana McAllister, the IT technical personnel, headed by Sir Gerard Modest and his assistant, John, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Foreign and Caricom Affairs, the presenters in the person of Mr. Reginald Dumas, whom I like to describe as the Dean of Former Diplomats of Trinidad and Tobago, Professor Andy Knight, Professor of International Relations, University of Alberta, Professor Thomas Bestica, Professor of Global Governance, Graduate Institute of Geneva, Professor Philip Osei, Deputy Rector, Ghana Institute of Management and Public Administration, Ms. Diane Quales, Director, Caribbean Sub-Regional Headquarters of United Nations, ECLAC, Mr. Curtis Reynolds, former Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters, Office for Disarmament Affairs, United Nations International Affairs Consultant. And distinguished audience and guests, one and all, I therefore wish to bring this session to a close with an Akan saying, Ji Nami, which means only God. I thank you.
Goodbye all.